So we'll go ahead and jump into it. Again, as a reminder, we're going to be recording for those who couldn't join today. Today, the purpose of the meeting today is really to try and start some dialogue around the issue, well, continue dialogue rather around the issue of skin quantification for the purposes of ensuring diversity of skin color, to the extent that's an issue for regulatory and standards that relate to pulse oximetry performance. There have been a lot of conversations happening, including a couple in recent weeks, and we were hoping that as part of the Open Oximetry project, we could try and bring some of these conversations together so that we can try and share what others are doing and prevent duplication and try and accelerate the progress on this topic, because there's a lot of ongoing research and also a lot of pressure to try and create changes, try and reduce some of the health and healthcare disparities that have been emerging related to pulse oximetry. I see a lot of folks on this call who are approaching this in different angles, some who are doing research directly on skin color quantification techniques, and others who are clinical trialists, industry, regulatory, and again, just trying to have an open dialogue. This is going to be a relatively informal meeting. The structure for this was hoping to share what people are doing in this space of trying to understand what are better ways to quantify skin color for this purpose, sharing sort of ongoing work that you're doing, lessons learned thus far, and data you've collected, or maybe things that you're have already published that others might not be aware of. And then lastly, an additional purpose of today's meeting is to try and create a more in-depth agenda for a meeting that the ISO committee is going to be meeting March 14th through 16th. It'll be a hybrid meeting. It will be in person in San Francisco for those who can join. And otherwise will be available to anybody to join in via Zoom. And during that meeting will be invitation for Open Oximetry Collaborators to join, but there will be discussion of this topic in particular. So today, in addition to sharing what you are working on, lessons learned from your own work, also if you could share what you feel at this point are the key research questions that are unanswered and how that relates to regulatory, and also who you think would be key presenters for that particular meeting. I think many of you on this call will be hopefully able to participate, if not speaking, and there will also be open discussion moderated during those sessions as well. So I'm hoping that one of the outputs of this meeting today can be a little bit more input on the agenda for more in-depth discussions that will feed into the standards. So I'm going to pause there because I see Sandy and Bob on here as well. I don't know if either of you want to discuss. Part of the genesis of this meeting is also your desire to convene folks, and we're teaming up on that. So just wanted to hand over to you if you want to say anything.
Sure, Sandy, why don't you have
You covered it well.
Go ahead, Bob. Or Sandy will go if Bob can't. So just briefly, we're holding this in conjunction with an ISO standards meeting on pulse oximeters, because of course we all have the same issues and we'd like the best science to go into the oximeter standard, and hopefully we're going to come to consensus on what we mean by that. And by the end of this meeting, we hope to be able to actually draft language to put in there and produce our draft. So look forward to everybody participating and listening and trying to figure out which direction we're going in. Thanks.
Much appreciate your help. And Mike, yeah, you set the stage well, and we've been working on the agenda together. So I think everything's covered from my perspective.
Sounds good, Bob. All right, thanks, Sandy. Why don't we jump into it? Hopefully, please don't feel the need to introduce an elaborate introduction to yourselves, but hopefully that's captured in the collaborators list. But I think I'll start the round robin here, but hopefully we can go around and just share on some of the work that people are doing in this space. I know some of us have had these conversations in recent weeks in much smaller groups, so apologies for some of the redundancy, but hopefully this is a step towards kind of getting that a little bit, broadening the group. So I'm just putting it in the chat again, kind of what I'm hoping we can go around starting off with here with these. I'm also putting the link to the minutes where I'll be keeping notes as well. And maybe with that, I don't know if maybe Josh, sorry to call on you, but would you be interested in sharing kind of what you've been up to and where you are with your work? I know you guys have been doing a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I guess briefly, what have we been up to? A lot of different things. So actually, I'm not sure if anyone showed up at the SPIE BIOS meeting a week or two ago, but we presented our kind of preliminary work towards a phantom-based test method for pulse oximetry, looking at developing turbid phantoms with channels using 3D printing and molding approaches. And we're working with a group that's done flow circuit measurements for PPG. So it was just kind of a very preliminary results on that work, and basically showing that we can generate PPG-esque signals with our phantoms, and doing some characterization, mechanical characterization, optical characterization, OCT imaging, micro CT imaging to really look at the morphology of the 3D printed structures. So that's kind of ongoing work. We're trying to get a literature review out the door on melanometry. Hopefully that will be in the not too distant future. And yeah, I think, trying to consider some of the recommendations on skin color measurement and ITA. Certainly been a lot of discussion about that recently. So I don't know if we're gonna share thoughts on the proposal that's been put forward later, but I have a few kind of initial thoughts on that.
Thanks, Josh. Just quick follow-up. Do you have a link to the abstract that's publicly available that we could put into the minutes?
I can put
the phantom-based test method.
I can put that into the chat if you'd like.
That'd be great.
Maybe I'll briefly mention, I'm not sure how common knowledge it is, but we had a paper that was published last year where we used phantom-based test methods for looking at cerebral oximeters and the impact of skin pigmentation. And we had developed a epidermal simulating layer that we could adjust the pigmentation, melanin simulating absorption spectrum. And so we're hoping to leverage that for our pulse oximeter phantoms as well. So I can put a link to that paper in the chat as well.
That'd be great if you could share that as well. That would be great. I know there's some other folks on this call who may have some comments about some of that work. Josh, you had mentioned the discussions about ITA, and you alluded to a recommendation. Which recommendation were you alluding to for discussion? I know there's a lot of circulating documents. I'm just not sure which.
Oh, I'm only aware of one document that came out of it said from a meeting with yourself and Vim and Leo and a couple.
Got it. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Maybe yes, we do want to comment on that. Maybe Paul Batchelder, I don't know if you're available. Do you want to share kind of what you're up to, but then also maybe a summary, or you and Wim about kind of what that what Josh was referring to?
Sure, I can lead off on that, and I'll share my screen. Let's see here, and whoops, hang on here. Okay. All right. So what Josh is referring to is the conversation, Michael, that you, Wim, Leo, Ellis, myself, Fifi was there, and Greg left. the people listed here. We were trying to consolidate what we thought we knew at that point to the best of our abilities, and we had a good discussion about the ways to measure and the important aspects that need to be captured. We understand that our premise was that we need an objective method of measurement that can be used by the clinical laboratories and so in some hospitalized environments, and as opposed to a color scale, which is very important as well, and we kind of preferred the Monk scale when looking at a subjective color chart. But what we came up with was what I'm showing here is that using the ITA measurement from a device that adheres to portions at least of the ISO CIE standard 11664-1, which is the colorimetry standard, and it has several aspects to it that we think are the best way to move. The device must output an L star, A star, B star, and then the traceability information must be available for the device that's used, because we understand that there are several colorimeters that purport to measure L star, A star, B star, but don't have traceability. They're more of a black box. We don't know, and we do know that they're subject to inaccuracies if they're roughly handled, and then they would need to be recalibrated. And the only way to do that is to send them back to the manufacturer, which is pretty much unacceptable for clinical use. And so we wanted to restrict the use to devices that are similar to the Konica Minolta or the X-Rite, that's X-RITE, which is a US device. Konica Minolta is made in Europe. The X-Rite people are the ones that own the Pantone scale, for example. And so this is what we discussed, and the heavy lifting on this was done by Wim and Leo, and requiring like the illuminant aperture and the observer angle must be specified and consistent. And then we talked a little bit about the LAB numbers and the fact that we use the arctan equation, which is a basic trigonomic function, to calculate the ITA. And the CIE defines several color spaces, but the L star, B star are required for the ITA calculation. And so for colorimetric devices that provide reflectance values, we also wanted to require to use the value where the reflectance is excluded. And so this is the bottom line of what we came up with. This is what we're seeing here. Be happy to share this with anyone. Wim provided this information. There's the ARC10 formula, and referring to the CIE body here. And then, so this particular bucketing of the ITA values, it has not been determined. But the point is that what we would like to have done is we would like all users to have a transferable apples to apples measurement method, and this is what we came up with.
Thanks very much, Paul, for sharing that. If you are comfortable sending me that document, I can put it into the minutes just as a link. Maybe Wim, do you want to add any additional comments?
Yeah, just one small addition or correction, if you will. I think the binning into 6 values, I think is actually defined uniquely by Delbino, I believe, by the Italian groups, and that is, I think, worthwhile. So the ITA is definitely, there's just one formula leading to the ITA, but also next the binning into a 6-value scale, and that's what I like to call it instead of a Fitzpatrick scale, because there's really a plethora of 6 value scales, and neither of them are actually Fitzpatrick. So that's why I started calling them 6 value scales, to avoid confusion with the actual Fitzpatrick. But yeah, the ITA mapping onto a 6 value scale is actually quite unique, and that is the small table. And I don't see a need necessarily to change that, because that will only lead to confusion again. That is the small remark I wanted to make. And perhaps another remark is that ITA is not necessarily, and the mapping onto a 6 value scale is not necessarily the best from all points of view. For example, linearity with perceived color, etc., etc. But at least it is uniquely defined, and that's what I think is needed. We do not want to spend our time on which scale do you mean, where did you get it from, which mapping, which melanin index from which device, which scale. This is a quite, actually a uniquely defined ITA and a uniquely defined mapping onto a 6 value scale. And that's, I think, why it is valuable.
Can I make just a quick comment?
Please, yeah, please, Sandy.
Just briefly, not to be contrarian, but we haven't really figured out what the relationship is between bias and pigmentation yet. We think we have some hypotheses. So I'm just putting a caveat out there that these are all hypotheses that still need to be tested and verified.
With respect to ratio size of oximetry, you mean, or?
Correct.
Okay, yeah, but the proposal that Paul is putting forward here, with the support of Leo and me, essentially has nothing to do with pulse oximetry. It's just about how to uniquely define skin tone and how we can agree on it. So it's
I agree 100%. And I think
related. I think it's true that I agree completely with you that any bias in pulse oximetry does not perhaps necessarily relate to skin tone at all. We as far as I'm concerned, we don't know. If that's the caveat you mean, I wholeheartly agree with you.
Yeah. I would just say that we started our meeting with that caveat as well. And I think it's, we're basically saying maybe skin tone by itself, maybe melanin content by itself affects scatter or affects signal to noise or something directly to make the signal inaccurate. Or maybe skin tone is a surrogate marker for some other underlying health disparities, which we know exist in our communities, and that those underlying health disparities are what lead to pulse oximeter inaccuracy. But either way, having some degree of method to that all of us use together to put people in bins so that we can track whether this is an issue or isn't an issue is useful. I will say the one point of small disagreement maybe between me and Wim is what the cutoffs are. What are the appropriate cutoffs to use for those bins? I think that when you go back to the first paper for ITA, they didn't really even include subjects with darker skin tone in their original cutoffs, and so they had a kind of an uneven distribution through the 90 to -90. So I think that's one thing to consider. We've thought about actually trying to have a way that maps to other useful scales like the Monk scale in a way that evenly distributes the Monk scale within the ITA. I see there's a question, has Monk scale bill specified by ITA values? I think that also brings up another really important point that I want everyone on the call to be aware of, which is if someone tells you, I know ITA, there is no way for you to determine what the color was in RGB space. There's not a one-to-one mapping. The same value of ITA can have an infinite number of different colors. And so we will have, and this is something I hope to be able to present at the in-person meeting, what does the Monk scale look like on ITA? What do other scales look like when you plot them in ITA? You can go from color to ITA, and you actually have to know what the illuminant was in order to make that transformation, but you cannot go from ITA to color. And so Michael has some suggestions through the OpenOx team of like other ways in which color can be incorporated into visualizing this space, but we really can't have this confusion between if you know ITA, then you know what the color is.
I agree completely with that. And to make things worse, even if you had the RGB, the three-dimensional color space, you cannot on that on another level relate that to an absolute melanin value, for example, because there are many different melanin distributions that can relate to the same color. So there's a non-uniqueness there as well. But
Thanks,
that's
Wim. Thanks. I'm going to go to Paul and Julian, and then after their comments, Leo, I don't know if you could pull up maybe that illustrative figure of kind of demonstrating your point of the many different shades of a single ITA value visually.
Yeah.
But maybe Paul, over to you, and then Julian after that.
Okay, great. I just wanted to make one comment that we talked a little bit about where to measure the pigmentation. Of course, there's a question of should we measure it at the sensor site? And you know, if it's on the finger, we would measure it at the finger pad as opposed to the nail. But then we also talked about the fact that a person's facial countenance is kind of how they've been themselves. You know, they say, oh, I'm this or I'm that. And so measuring from the forehead, for example, might capture that. And it might be worthwhile to simply add that to the mix. But if you're going to bin for baseline skin pigmentation, you know, we know there are variabilities in the finger pads and the soles of the feet and so forth. But if you're going to bin, Dr. Smilovich made it clear that the baseline location is the inner upper arm. I know some people use the inner forearm, but we're recommending that be the location, the inner upper arm. That's my comment.
Thanks, Paul. Maybe we'll go to Julian for a comment, and then maybe Ellis after that, if you wouldn't mind commenting on Paul. Julian, over to you.
Yeah, I just had a question. The comment that was just made that skin tone might be a marker for other health disparities seemed like a broad comment. I felt like there was something in that comment that I didn't understand, and if there, just clarify what your intent was.
Well, I think there are many potential variables that could affect the pulse oximeter signal accuracy, the lookup table between R and SpO2. One of those could be diabetes. One of those could be peripheral vascular resistance. One of those could be perfusion. There are underlying medical comorbidities that may turn those values to not correspond between patients.
Got it.
Right. So
sure.
It could be that the original Schoeting study really was the skin color, which was self-identified by the patients themselves, wasn't even measured, not even by Fitzpatrick scale.
Right.
Maybe that was just a surrogate for some underlying medical comorbidity that is really the cause of this variation.
So I think the way of stating it as a comorbidity is clear to me. The way of stating it as a disparity is what confused me.
I see.
But sure, comorbidities, coexisting conditions, other
I would say in the sense that,
it's the disparity. I wasn't sure what you meant.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that.
For sure. The only reason I was using the word disparity is that among patients who have darker skin, the degree of medical comorbidities may be higher, and that is a disparity that exists.
Yeah, got it. Yeah.
Maybe Ellis, over to you.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Comment. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yep, just really quickly, my name is Ellis Monk. I am at Harvard University, where I'm an associate professor of sociology. Pertinent to today's meeting, I am the creator of the Monk Skin Tone Scale, which I developed as part of epidemiological research with the National Social Life, Health, and Aging Project, which is an NIH-funded, nationally representative longitudinal survey on ethno-racial health disparities in the United States. I'm an investigator on that team, which is run out of University of Chicago and Newark. And that scale is used in that study and continuing to be used in that study as the means of classifying skin tone, measuring skin tone for that study. And the Monk Skin Tone Scale, which I developed, has also been adopted by Google and is used in their search engine and the Pixel camera phone filters, and you name it, basically everything with computer vision, everything at Google at this point is normed using the Monk scale instead of the Fitzpatrick scale. So just a couple of quick comments about, the Monk scale and relative to the Fitzpatrick. One of the reasons for developing the scale is that the Fitzpatrick scale was not actually originally designed to classify skin tone. So there always has been this disconnect between how it's been adopted and used and what it was actually designed to do. So one of the reasons why the Monk skin tone scale was adopted by Google, for instance, is the long-standing dissatisfaction over the Fitzpatrick scale, especially as a means of classifying skin tone for people who are not white. So just to kind of put that on the record so that everyone knows the context where the Monk skin tone scale has emerged. In terms of the research that's being done with the scale, so I've conducted a lot of research with Google using the scale, which is already shown in some papers that are under review, that the scale is perceived to be significantly more representative and inclusive than the Fitzpatrick in terms of the classification of skin tone. And that research, which is under review and kind of, bracketed by Google right now for all kinds of reasons, that research gave them enough confidence to adopt that scale in their own research. So in addition to the epidemiological research I do with the scale, there's also the technological side that I've been doing with Google. And also pertinent to today's meeting, I have an NIH grant, the NIH Director's New Innovator Award, which is supporting my research on pulse oximetry and skin tone, where I'll be collaborating with a physicist, and I'm also a member of this open oximetry project. So if you have questions about the scale, please feel free to reach out. I don't want to inundate everyone with all the information, but to quickly answer the question in the chat, we do have a mapping of that Monk skin tone scale to ITA bins and all of that. And I also have the RGB values and all of that more objective mathematical information about the scale. That's all going to be readily available. So thank you.
Ellis, quickly before we get over to Mike Bernstein, do you think it would be possible to lift an embargo on any of could you present any of the data in March, maybe between now and then, try and get some permissions to share some sneak peek of what's coming down the pipeline to help inform some of what we're talking about?
So my hope is that I'll be able to share at least some of the results from the studies I did with Google, which show that it's perceived to be much more inclusive and representative to a nationally representative sample of people in the United States than, say, the Fitzpatrick. So I'm hoping to be able to share that by March. Hopefully, I'm working on that. The other thing I'll note as well is that I've already been in preliminary conversations with Pantone around the scale and doing even more work to further standardize that scale for printing. So that's already moving along and is in process as well.
Thanks very much, Alice. Appreciate that. Mike Bernstein, over to you.
I just quickly wanted to interject on the, by the way, for anybody who doesn't know, I'm a design engineer and I've designed a lot of pulse oximeters, but maybe describing it as a comorbidity isn't the right thing. I don't know, but what really matters, and it's hard to deconvolve what we're doing from light transmission and perfusion. And from an engineering point of view, the amount of light transmitted through the measurement site is as important as perfusion. And the two of those together have a dramatic effect on signal to noise ratio and therefore performance. And I think the biggest challenge of what we're doing is deconvolving skin color from, as we've discussed, all the other things that can affect pulse oximetry accuracy. That's it. That's my whole comment.
Thanks, Mike. Paul Batchelder, over to you.
Yeah, just one more thing. I really appreciate your comments, Ellis. And I did not know that someone had categorized the Monk scale to ITA values. That would be very interesting, and I'm wondering if you can when
that's Leo.
Yeah, I did.
Oh,
yeah, I did. I can show you that. Yeah, I can show you that now. We're going to hopefully show a paper about that too. I will say one thing. I just want to, perhaps I'm wrong about this, but in terms of thinking about, signal to noise and all these things, I think signal to noise is certainly a potential hypothesis. I know, Chetan's on the call. He's done Monte Carlo modeling of light transport, and his data suggests that actually the differential path length from scattering, and he can explain it better, but that melanin actually has a true effect on scattering. But another hypothesis just to throw out there is, if you think about what's happening, the signal is oscillating because there's more blood or less blood with each heartbeat. And if your vessels happen to be stiffer and they didn't stretch as much with every heartbeat, then there would be less of an oscillatory signal as well. And so that is a physiological difference that can be present in some people versus others. And again, if some of these physiological differences are disease associated, let's say hypertension, diabetes, other things that increase peripheral vascular resistance, then that is a comorbidity, a medical comorbidity that affects the interpretation of the signal. Addressing that comorbidity may require, FDA saying you have to have a certain number of people and the size of the validation set has to be such, and these are the factors that we have to validate against. But I think all of those things we should keep an open mind to. And the component of it being a disparity is purely, a consequence of our society having medical access disparities between people who have darker skin and people who don't. And that's why I use those terms. I don't mean to kind of inject any sort of scientific inconsistencies here. I'm just trying to keep our minds open to that possibility. It's not purely the pigment, but that the pigment is a surrogate marker for something else.
And I think also there's some recent studies that suggest that it's not just the melanin that gives a bias, but the combination of a low perfusion index with a higher melanin concentration. So indeed,
perfusion index is derived from the pulse oximeter signal as well. Yeah. And that one, I certainly is very sensitive to signal to noise because it depends on the DC signal as well. So I
saw the comment from Sandy Weininger that we want to have bins according to the effect, and that would be ideal, of course, but we do not know the root cause, so we cannot really define the effect by that. But I think what we are arguing for with the pigmentation measurement method is that we all agree on the same method, such that studies can be comparable and that they can be having higher power because of their higher precision. So a study where you look into racial bias of pulse oximeters will have a higher statistical value if your skin measurement method is more precise. And that will serve our goal of finding the root cause faster, I think, if we agree on a measurement method, and that is precise and unique and definable. And that is the underlying thought behind it. Because I agree completely with everybody that melanin is not necessarily considered to be the main root cause for the bias, but it may be one tool to find out. Yeah.
Thanks, Wim. Leo, maybe you could share your screen. Josh, is it okay if you follow Leo's share here?
Sure.
Go for it, Leo.
Okay, this is just a simple calculation of all of these circles have an ITA of 0. Just a very simple demonstration. You have the ITA of 0 set because the L is 50, and that just shows you that you can have very different colors with the same ITA. In terms of something to consider is if you look at this cutoff is a little bit funny, but let me show you the Monk scale. So the Monk scale is a scale that goes from 1 to 10. These are the RGB values of the Monk scale. And if you were to convert that into LAB space, assuming a certain illuminant, then this is where it falls in the ITA plane. And so the ITA values range from 83 degrees to -84 degrees, and this is where they fall. Now, if you were to say, let's use the Delbino bins for the Monk scale, you get something like this, where basically the first 4 values of the Monk scale are all in just the top cutoff, and bottom 3 are in the bottom, and then there's some that don't even show up. So it doesn't really, that Delbino cutoff does not evenly distribute the Monk scale. So, this is a point that we hope to publish and put out in the literature as an opinion, but I would say, since we don't know what the effect is and we don't know what the right cutoffs are, having something that evenly distributes a scale of perception would make the most sense. And so, something that is, I'll plot it again and show you, but something that's more evenly separated might make more sense. But that's just, that's one idea, one approach that I think would make sense. And I see Jim Stafford's asking, what's the advantage of ITA over CIE Lab? So CIE Lab would be the full L star, A star, B values. That's like a 3-dimensional color space. It's one type of 3-dimensional color space. Again, it depends on illuminance, certain assumptions. If you're using a color space, you might as well use RGB. You could say, why not just use RGB? I think the ITA is a single number. That's one advantage. It makes it, with a single number, it is possible to assign bins. If you don't have a single number, you have 3-dimensional space, it's hard to kind of imagine how are you going to assign bins. So I think that's why it's nice to have a single number. And it does look like ITA seems to vary across the spectrum of human pigmentation. As Joshua said, like, there are studies that demonstrate a linear correlation between ITA and melanin content, for example. So there is something about ITA that captures human pigmentation in a causal fashion. I think that those are some of the reasons why using a number like ITA makes sense.
Thanks, Leo.
Okay.
Let's just go to Josh real quick, because he may have had a comment related to something earlier, and then Wim will go over to you. Josh, over to you.
Yeah, number of comments. Where to start here? Can I share my screen?
You should be able to. If not, let me know and I'll fix that.
So, talking about this idea of ITA and the distribution of bins, that's something we've been thinking about as well. So there's a really interesting, the Delbino papers are very interesting. I encourage people to go look at them. One of the places where I think that original categorization of ITA into these different bins came is this paper that actually shows individual data points for different subjects. And if you look at this, you actually can see that the limit for very light skin is only about 55 degrees. And yet there's a category that's above 55 degrees. There's almost no subjects above this. So the original scale, I think, was inherently flawed in that there's basically an almost empty category at the top. So anyways, in looking at this, my thought process was I'm much more in favor of considering this a surrogate for melanin content. I think melanin is really the important factor here. It's been shown over and over in the literature to significantly impact optical signals. There's all sorts of data on this. You can hand wave about other potential factors that could influence it, the rigidity of vessels. There's the literature evidence for those hand waving ideas is minuscule. So my thought is we really need a metric that's going to focus on trying to estimate what the melanin content of the skin is. And as Delbino has done, they've correlated ITA with melanin content using HPLC and histology. So it's not a perfect correlation. I think there's more research that's needed on it, but that's why I support ITA, is that there actually has been quantitative data correlating ITA to melanin content of the epidermis. So in terms of binning, I like the idea of saying, okay, there's this full range of human melanin content levels. let's set up the maximum, the minimum, and just divide that in equal categories by equal levels of melanin, and or bin by equal delta ITA levels. So you can do that with six bins, like Fitzpatrick. You could do it with 10 bins, like the Monk scale. But whatever approach is best for a statistical analysis, I think should probably determine that. But this is the way that I think is the optimal approach for implementing ITA.
Josh, thanks for sharing that. I was wondering, Chetan, not to put you on the spot, but I'm wondering if you might share a little bit about the work that you've been up to, and then we can open up for more comments. I'm sure there's some comments based on what Josh had to say as well. Leo, can we go to Chetan real quick? And then
sorry about that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think this idea of the complexity of isolating pigmentation against all of these other factors experimentally is valid, right? That's absolutely a difficult thing to do. In computational models, we have the luxury of being able to do that, though. And when you look at it from that perspective, results from Monte Carlo models support kind of what Josh is saying, which is that pigmentation specifically, fractional volume of melanin in melanocytes changes the oximeter ratiometric output R. That said, other things change it too. Perfusion changes it. Confounding factors such as scattering, bilirubin content, these things, these all have a factor. So it's not out of the question that there are factors that pull bias in the ratiometric measure R in one way or another, but certainly our findings suggest that melanocytes, fractional volume of melanocytes is a primary factor.
thanks, Chetan. Leo, back over to you if you wanted to respond to Josh or other comments.
No, I mean, I 100% agree with Josh. I'm sorry if my coming up with hand-waving hypotheses is not intended to say that, melanin is not an effect. I want to keep our minds open to the possibility that there's other things going on. I think it's definitely clear that melanin will certainly affect the signal. For photoacoustic imaging, as was presented at SPIE, and I was there and I saw the talks and they were great. I mean, it's clear, it's very clear. With pulse oximetry, it's this AC component, and so perhaps the question is that going to be as strong an effect? I mean, that's still, I think, open to more research, and I'm looking forward to seeing the pulse oximeter studies done on the phantoms. And we're in my lab, we're making phantoms as well, trying to address that same question. So hopefully we'll either come up with similar results or find ways to push the results and get clarity on it. But in terms of ITA, I also agree. ITA, I think, is a good number to use. I do think it probably correlates to melanin content. Agree with that as well. The only kind of suggestion or point out there is the bins, which bins to include. So, very, very light skin. There are patients out there, they may not be included in studies studies that Delbino had. Certainly in clinic as a dermatologist, I see people with very, very light skin who have zero pigment in their skin. They have deficiencies in enzymes that create melanin. So there's literally no melanin at all. But if we were to take something like the Monk scale, which has these 10 different color scales that are being used, as Ellis said, in a variety of different settings, we could come up with an ITA cutoffs like these that are designed to kind of ensure that there's equal distribution of Monk scales within those ITA cutoffs. The only kind of reason to do it this way is just to equally bin people into those cutoffs, so that no single ITA bin has more than a couple of Monk scales in it. Whether the Monk scale is a true, even spread of pigment, I mean, that's kind of to be decided, to be determined. Go ahead, Alice, sorry.
So just really quickly on this point. So one of the main reasons in terms of my creation of the scale was one thing that I noticed in talking with dermatologists, and when we launched the scale with NSHAP, is if we use things like the Massey-Martin scale, one of the issues was that if people could see the Massey-Martin scale pulled up, one of my former colleagues created about 25 years ago, a lot of the different hands on that Massey-Martin scale, they're kind of indistinguishable once you get to the number 8. So it's really hard for human beings to actually distinguish between those when they're trying to build a sample that's representative to do a study. So that was one of the issues. And then with the Fitzpatrick scale, one of the issues was that, strangely enough, it was simultaneously too dark for some lighter skinned people. So as Leo was pointing out, and others have pointed out as well, there are actually people who are lighter skinned than some of the earlier values on the Fitzpatrick scale in terms of the color. And the Fitzpatrick scale was not dark enough for some of the darker patients as well. So that's kind of the thinking, the context behind the Monk skin tone scale. And as you can see here, it covers that large range along the entire ITA. And I do think that these bins make a lot of sense to make that a tractable scale for people to use when they use a subjective scale.
Ellis, thanks. Wim, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I just have 2 remarks, actually. One on the color space, the RGB versus LAB. The LAB was designed specifically actually to make the color perceived differences between 2 points in that 3D space homogeneous, so that you can actually calculate the Cartesian distance between 2 color points. And therefore, it is typically preferred if you want to do color measurements in terms of perception. RGB and XYZ, etc., are a bit more scientific, and they're very non-homogeneous. So that's why LAB is preferred these days. And with respect to the ITA and the binning, well, first of all, I'm very happy that we seem to all agree that colorimetry and subsequent ITA mapping is preferred. And then I actually would prefer to map it onto a 10 scale value like the Monk scale rather than the 6 value scale of Delbino, because that would get rid of the false suggestion in my view that it is a Fitzpatrick mapping, and it is not. The Fitzpatrick should, in my view, be referred to only when you talk about a response to UV. And it would also break with the many 6 value scales that are around. MI is being mapped to a 6 value scale. There are different color scales that have 6 values. Now ITA is also mapped to a 6 value scale, and they're all different. And I would be very much in favor if we map it onto the 10 value scale of the Monk scale, which also has the advantage that it has a bit higher precision actually than the 6 values. So that's my 2 cents, literally 2 topics.
Thanks very much, Wim. Paul, over to you, and then we'll try and go through a couple of questions that have come in the chat.
Okay, you know, Kumu also mentioned something, and I'm wondering how many of the U.S. demographics fall into each Monk ITA group. For example, you know, we talked about they're very light people up in the top end and very dark people in the bottom end. I'm wondering how that Ellis matches or reflects the US population.
Sure, absolutely. So this is one of the common questions, like what is the actual skin tone distribution in the United States, other countries, you know, around the world? So in the United States, there's a few gold standard nationally representative surveys that at least give us estimates for African Americans, Hispanics in terms of skin tone. Now they're using subjective scales and they're not mapped to ITA. So that becomes kind of a black boxing. But in some of these studies that have been done, if you look at the, say, general distribution among African Americans, for instance, if we looked at the Monk skin tone scale and we use 5 bins, you'd probably have anywhere from about 10 to 15% of African Americans who would actually be in that first bin of having somewhat lighter skin. And that, of course, you know, tracks the history of the 1 drop rule in the United States and all of that. And I won't get into all of that complicated history. And then anywhere from, say, 35 35 to 45% are going to be in the middle range of that Monk scale, with another 20 to 30% all the way out on the end of that distribution. So if we thought about that 10-point scale is only 5, you know, you'd have like 10, then 20, and then you'd have a large range in the middle, and then you'd have, you know, about 20% are darker skin, at least among African Americans. So it's
Thanks,
not,
Alice.
it's not the case that the bins are totally equal within the Black population at the very least. No.
Thanks.
Thanks for the question, Paul. I just wanted to flag, also just as a side comment, a lot of the focus of this call, certainly a lot of mostly researchers and folks based here in the US. A lot of the regulatory interest is here in the US and in other high income countries, but just flagging that the issue of negative impact from pulse oximetry, the majority of that may be in populations outside of high income countries. And so, you know, anything that we're talking about, while for explicitly the purposes of some regulatory bodies may be focused on certain countries, that it really is important to take into consideration the fact that the greatest potential harm here is globally, not in the US, and just more broadly, even in high income countries in general. So just to encourage everybody to continue to think a little bit broadly about what populations we're trying to serve with anything we do, because like many regulations, usually it's poor communities outside of high income countries, but also within, that are hurt the most by the rules that are made with these types of panels.
Super quickly on that point, that again makes it really important that we have a scale that can capture the diversity of non-white skin tones, because most of the countries around the world, Africa, parts of Asia, they're non-white people. So this is again emphasizing why this is really important to get correctly.
Thanks, Ellis. Josh, over to you.
Great. So, you know, I did mention before that I think ITA is probably a good solution, but I don't want to get overly enthusiastic about it, because I think it also has inherent flaws, and we need to keep an open mind for other approaches. And I think in the long run, other approaches that are developed, if they are continued to be developed, will be better. So, you know, inherently, ITA is based on the human perception of color. So you're taking the full spectrum and you're decomposing it into 3 different spectra. So you're inherently limiting yourself in terms of the information you're using to generate this final ITA value. And then in my mind, we're kind of mapping ITA to the melanin content. I think if you used a full spectral measurement, you could do a much better job probably of mapping to melanin content and removing any confounding factors, confounding chromophores like bilirubin. And I was going to say something else. Yeah, it's probably, you know, it's a decent approach for now, but in the future, I think there'll be better ways to do it. It's just that, you know, melanin index right now is not standardized, certainly, whereas ITA is standardized.
I completely agree. I think a more direct measure of the actual chromophores involved would be the best ideal measurement. And, you know, a more complete data like what you get from a spectrometer, actually, you know, from which all this stuff is derived anyway, right? You take the spectrum and then you assume something about the response of the illuminant and human color perception and the CIE standard. It's all a bunch of formulas applied to the reflectance measure, from the spectrometer. So I totally agree. In your chat question, you asked, like, is there evidence that there's people with a greater than 76 ITA? I think it's a great question. My response is, if there are people with a Monk scale of 1 or 2, then probably yes, but maybe they're very few. I would also say it depends where you measure it, right? Like, a lot of this is, you know, in the same person, ITA measured at your forehead, ITA measured at your finger, ITA measured at your inner arm are going to be different because they're perceptibly different colors. And so the ITA will be different too.
I guess I kind of trust Delbino's, you know, Delbino has published a lot of good work, and I kind of trust if they show a range of, within the human population, that's probably true. Perhaps there's data out there showing higher ITAs, but I think we have to see that before we extend the bins that far. I was going to make one other point. I remembered what I was going to say before about colorimeters versus spectroscopy. Colorimeters are not designed to selectively detect chromophores in the epidermis. You could, a good optical engineer could probably design a device that was much more selectively sensing the epidermis and what's going on without getting the confounding effect of the deeper layers and the chromophores that reside there. So that's it.
Well, I think that's completely.
Although for the purposes of transmission, there may be relevance to some of those other layers, for just to play devil's advocate on that piece.
No,
but
no,
you're shaking your head, Joshua.
No, because we're trying to get at melanin.
But it's separate issues. Skin color, agreed. But for the broader conversation of pulse ox confounders, it may be interesting to see what's going on deeper. But agree with your point. When, what were we going to say?
Yeah, I completely agree that spectrophotometry gives a rich content, and for example, the lower wavelengths, 400 nanometers, they are known to sample much more just the epidermis rather than the deeper skin. So it's a rather pure measurement of what's going on in the epidermis. But I think what is nice about the ITA is that it can be measured with relatively inexpensive devices, even an RGB camera if you calibrate it well, because it is colorimetry based, and a spectrophotometer is just a fancy version of a colorimeter, which gives you extra information, but it costs more money. But I think that is what is nice about the choice that hopefully we are going to make, that it is colorimetry based, that is offering some inexpensive options, as well as compatible with the more scientifically inclined spectrophotometric measurements. So, and again, if we map it onto a 10 value scale, like the Monk scale, I would prefer that. No.
Thanks, Wim. We have 1 minute to wrap up. There's one additional question here that Paul Mannheimer asked along the lines of what Mike Bernstein pointed out with red and IR. Has anyone looked at whether ITA or essentially B stars key factor overall? Anybody want to comment on that quickly? And then while we're wrapping up, if anybody wants to put into the chat any suggestions for additional questions that need to be answered, topics that we should address in the March meeting, please put them in the chat or email me directly. But anybody want to respond to Paul Mannheimer's?
I mean, you need, it's a triangle. The height of the triangle is L minus 50. The base of the triangle is B. And so
now the question, that's not quite, it's not quite the question. The question is really, is the L star the key component, excuse me, is L star, yeah, that's right. Is L star the key component that's going to talk about the impact to red and infrared, as opposed to the yellowness of the tissue? I agree that that's going to correlate to what the appearance to your eye is, but the pulse oximeter doesn't care what your skin looks like. It cares what's the red and infrared transmission. That was Mike's point. And L star itself might actually be a stronger correlate than the LAB value.
Right.
I can make a comment on that. I think it's just a mapping that they chose from RGB or LAB to a pigmentation value. And I think the value right now is just in that we have all gotten used to it and that we agree on that definition, that one formula. And like Josh said, there will be more advanced formulas, more precise formulas, but that is fine tuning. And I think for now, the value lies simply in the fact that we agree on a formula and that there is no confusion about different formulas, different mappings, etc. I think for now, that is the most important thing.
I think collecting the entire spectra or collecting the LAB values from a colorimeter are certainly far superior to what we're currently doing. So I fully agree with that. And that'll allow the research to figure out what's important.
Yeah, and the melanin index from a maximeter might be more precise in measuring melanin, but the big disadvantage is that it is not defined. And if that company goes bankrupt, we have nothing. And colorimetry is well defined. So that there's a lot of value in that, I think.
Yeah, I would say probably the more melanin someone has, the more L star is going to be. Like L star will have more of an impact for people with darker skin than lighter skin, because that's where luminance will vary more. So it's a good point to say, like, one of those variables may have more of weight in that final calculation. And I think if you go to the Delbino paper that Josh showed, like if you go back to the curves, the L-star variation is higher among the African population than the white population, for example. So I think that maybe speaks to Mike's question and Paul, your point about it.
Well, we're at the end of the hour, so we'll go ahead and wrap up. I appreciate everybody for sharing candidly. Please throw into the chat topics and questions. We will be reaching out early next week. Everybody in this meeting and beyond will get an invitation to the March meeting that we're going to be doing concurrently with the ISO standard meeting. And there will be lots of opportunity to discuss and present proposals for how to move forward and to share additional details on your work. This was really helpful to try and get a sense of that. Thanks for bearing with us on a rapid fire kind of improvisational presentation style. And thanks for joining. Please reach out to me with any questions, and we'll share information from this meeting on the OpenOx community portal, and you'll get an email from us and follow up. So thanks again. Hope everybody has a good day. I'll stick around if there's any additional questions.